The first time the face appeared at the window, Alice was completely alone. She was dressed in a onesie, holding a cup of licorice tea and keeping an eye on some dancing competition or other on the television. It was 3 days before Christmas, and Matt was working a late shift at the factory. Sitting with the curtains open had never bothered her before. She preferred it. Their back garden was enclosed by hedging on all sides, so she knew there wouldn't be anyone peering in. And on nights with a full moon, she loved the eerie effect of a dimly lit lawn being visible from the safety of the sofa. Matt would be the one who felt uncomfortable, saying that he preferred the coziness of a room when the outside world was completely out of sight. On the evenings that she insisted on leaving the curtains undrawn, he would sit closer to her and hold her hand, which Alice found cute, charming and endearing. Matt often worked late into the evening, and it had never been an issue for Alice at all. They lived in a detached house on a secluded street in a quiet part of the suburbs, but she never felt isolated or vulnerable. Her sister found the area creepy, but her sister had always been a touch melodramatic and always been fond of the supernatural. The fact that there was a graveyard less than half a mile from the house had always been a source of concern for Sister Tina, and her housewarming present to Alice had been an ornamental crystal, chosen for its supposed ability to ward off restless spirits. Alice had chuckled, said a wary "thank you," and left it in a drawer in the kitchen. But the first time the face appeared at the window, she wondered whether she shouldn't go and retrieve it. Human beings are hardwired to recognise faces in things, Alice said out loud to herself as she sat at the kitchen table, shaking slightly. We see them everywhere, even in inanimate objects. Patterns in wallpaper, cracks in pavements, even knots in tree bark can be misinterpreted by an imaginative mind. Whatever I saw outside, it wasn't anything with a face. She took a big sip from her mug of hot chocolate and pulled her dressing gown a little tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes checked every corner of the room for movement before settling on the clock mounted above the microwave. 10:15 p.m. Matt wouldn't be home for another hour. Alice reached for her phone, wanting to hear a reassuring voice, but soon hesitated. Who would she call? Her two closest friends had young children, so it was too late in the day to disturb either of them. Mum had been dead for a year. Her dad was in New Zealand with his 23-year-old fiancée, and telling Tina what she thought she had seen would have her sister turning up with an exorcist. No, whatever was going on, she would have to work through it on her own. In the end, Alice did something she had not done since her age had reached double figures. She went to bed and pulled the covers right up over her head. Matt ate breakfast the way a whale eats krill, open wide and inhale as much food as possible in one go. Alice fought down her daily dose of disgust and reminded herself that this was a good man with many nice qualities whom she loved dearly. You have trouble sleeping last night? He asked, reaching for the coffee jug to top up his morning cuppa. You seem to be moving around a lot. Alice took a bite of her toast and wondered how honest she wanted to be. Not really, babe, she said. I think I had too much sugary stuff and my body was still absorbing it. I need to cut down on the evening indulgences, maybe. Matt smiled and leant over to kiss her. Nah, stuff that, he said. It's Christmas. Indulgences are what it's all about. If anything, you should ramp up your intake to get your body ready for the oncoming onslaught. By the end of Boxing Day, Alice had convinced herself that the incident was nothing more than a trick of the light. An old bit of plastic or a carrier bag had blown over the hedge and flashed by the window, and her mind had scared her unnecessarily. She had been half asleep, she reasoned, and that was why it had startled her so much. She had been silly. So the second time the face appeared, she was so surprised that she nearly burst into tears immediately. It was lunchtime, broad daylight, and she wasn't alone. That's what made her feel so awful. She couldn't put this one down to tiredness, too much sugar, or loneliness. Matt had the whole day off work for once, and had arranged for them to meet his brother and his partner for a leisurely walk by the river, followed by a nice lunch at a pub called the Angler's Arms. They were still serving turkey lunches, but not charging $69.95 for them the way they were on Christmas Day, so it was a chance for a nice family festive meal without the need to spend hours in the kitchen or to spend ridiculous amounts of money. And it was lovely, right up to the point that Alice saw the face. Are you all right, Alice? You've gone very pale. asked Honey, Matt's sister-in-law. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Alice, with her heart pounding in her chest and her eyes locked on the spot across the river where the face had clearly appeared, was starting to think that maybe that was exactly what she had seen. "I shouldn't have had that glass of wine before eating," she said, still staring at the opposite riverbank. "I've just gone a little bit light-headed." She'd never been one for dishonesty, but how could she explain what was happening? For the first time in her life, she was seeing things. Well, not seeing things, but seeing a particular thing. A hideous, scarred, twisted, demonic face with a dark sculpted moustache and piercing narrow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul and leave her feeling threatened and exposed. 3 days later, she saw it again. And 3 days after that, she saw it again. Sat in the office at work on her first day back after the Christmas break, she started moving a pile of papers and spotted it out in the car park, hovering between the cars belonging to 2 of her colleagues. Then on the Friday, pushing a trolley around her local supermarket, it clearly appeared in the window of the door that led out from the shop floor to the warehouse. Alice felt a new emotion rise up this time, cutting through the fear and surprise and pushing her into action. That emotion was anger. Abandoning her trolley, she strode purposefully towards the door, determined to find out once and for all what or who was tormenting her. The door was locked and only accessible via a keypad. Alice put her face right up against the window, trying to spot if anything was on the other side. All she could see was a large bank of shelves, with the nearest one stocked full of toilet rolls. A voice behind her asked, "Can I help you, miss?" She turned round to face a male employee, probably aged about 20, with a wispy hint of a goatee beard and several festering whiteheads. His name badge announced him as Aaron, and he was holding a pricing gun like it was a weapon. "Sorry," said Alice. "I thought I saw someone I knew." "The warehouse is only for use by employees," Aaron said quietly. "But if there's anything you particularly need, I'll be happy to see if we have it in stock." Alice looked away embarrassed and started walking back to her trolley. "No, it's fine," she said. "I'm fine." But she knew full well that she wasn't. On the way home, she took a small detour to go and visit Honey. The supermarket incident had left her shaken again, and so she texted Honey and asked if she could pop round for a cuppa and a chat. "I feel really silly saying this out loud, but it's really bothering me, and if I don't get it out of my head, it's probably going to send me crazy." Alice told her the full story. The initial surprise of the face outside at home, her shock at its reappearance when they were out for lunch, and the unsettling reoccurrences since. Honey listened quietly and then fetched them a packet of biscuits. "Sounds to me like you're overtired, babe. They've been working you extra hard in the office." "Well, no, not at all," said Alice. "If anything, it's slower than normal. Most of our clients order less in December, so it tends to be a quiet period for us." "Any other symptoms? Weird headaches, dizziness, that kind of thing?" "No, nothing at all. I actually feel really healthy at the moment. Best I've felt in ages." Said Honey. "Have you tried looking it up online? Bound to be some info and advice somewhere on our good old friend the internet." "No, I've been too scared to, if I'm honest. I'm worried I might read something scary." "Well, I'll look for you then," said Honey, "and filter out the scary stuff." Honey reached over to the worktop and picked up her mobile phone from its charging station. "Right, Alice, I found a symptom checker thingy on its American clinic's website. We'll have a go at this. Should be a laugh, if nothing else. Right. Are you taking any recreational drugs?" Alice smiled. "No, unless a protein bar counts." "Any recent changes to regular medications?" "No, I take a multivitamin every morning, but it's the same one I've used for months now." "Have you been to any exotic foreign locations recently?" "I wish. We can't even afford a weekend in Brighton at the moment." The questions carried on in a similar vein. Alice found herself answering no to almost all of them, and was convinced the whole thing was going to be a waste of time. "OK, that's the end of the survey," said Honey. "The algorithm is doing its thing, and here we go." She held her phone up as if it was a Bible and she was about to deliver a sermon. Possibly closed eye hallucinations, although that mostly seems to affect people when they're in bed at night and sounds unlikely to flare up during your weekly shop, if you ask me. Could be a sign of an eye infection or the after effects of the eye being recently scratched by a foreign object. "Well, that doesn't fit," said Alice. "I think I'd have remembered that happening. What else does it say?" Let me see. It could also be an indicator of dementia, but I think you're a few decades too young for that. Or an indicator of a hormone imbalance, such as that experienced in the early stages of... Oh! Honey paused and looked up at Alice, wide-eyed, a playful smirk on her face. "Alice, is there any chance you might be pregnant?" When the situation was confirmed at their doctor's surgery, Matt took the news with his usual nonchalant ease. Alice felt her stomach turn over multiple times, but Matt just nodded his head calmly. When the nurse asked if they had any questions, Matt actually replied, "Does this mean we have to get married?" Not a romantic response, but Alice put it down to the shock. Becoming parents was not something they had planned or even discussed as a future possibility, and now it was a definite thing. It was happening. By the time next Christmas came round, they would have a baby. Well, no wonder Matt seemed a little dazed. The next few days were difficult. Alice found herself having waves of panic, and she would burst into tears over the slightest little thing. A spillage of salt while putting away her groceries on Friday, an article online about an abandoned puppy on Saturday, and an unexpected message from her dad on Sunday were all enough to turn her into an emotional wreck, sobbing to herself in the kitchen. Tina insisted on bringing round various herbal remedies to help Alice cope with the changes in her body, and insisted on hanging various symbols around the house to protect the unborn from the sinister machinations of the underworld. Alice always struggled to deal with her sister's idiosyncrasies at the best of times. Coping with her through 9 months of pregnancy felt like it could be an impossible cross to bear. But as her emotions settled down and her brain wrapped itself around the truth of what was to come, Alice found herself feeling incredibly optimistic and contented. Her colleagues at work were especially supportive and protective, and for the first time since she started there, Alice was glad to be the youngest employee in an office full of older women. All of them had children of their own, and all were happy to be on hand with guidance, wisdom, and love. As the weeks passed, Matt became a revelation. After his initial shock and fear had subsided, his enthusiasm grew, and he couldn't do enough for the mum-to-be, making sure she was comfortable and well-fed, and making her feel, probably for the first time in their relationship, truly loved and appreciated. He also became a bit of an expert on childbirth and parenting, watching every available video on YouTube and even getting books out of the library. In their time together, she had only ever seen him look at car magazines. Now he had a stack of books on his bedside table, all of them related to children. By the time Alice reached her 3rd semester, all thoughts of the face had been banished from her mind. The summer was a hot one, and her expanding body felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar. But generally speaking, Alice was as happy as she could ever remember being. "I guess pregnancy is ultimately what we're created for," she explained to Honey over a glass of sparkling water in the garden one afternoon. "So it just feels like I'm doing what I'm designed to do, and it feels so right." "Wow, don't let the feminists hear you say that, they'll be ripping your eyes out." Alice laughed, something she had done a lot over these past few months. "I'm sure they would," she said, "but I don't mean it that way. I just mean that my body is responding naturally to what's happening, and if I just let it get on with it, everything feels great." She took a big sip of her drink. "Although I have to say I'm starting to feel like a clumsy walrus these days, and that doesn't feel natural at all." Honey laughed before looking wistfully at her drink. "You know, Ian's been pressuring me about pregnancy recently." Alice nearly fell off her chair in surprise. "You're kidding?" "No, I'm not. I think he's been watching the positive changes in Matt and thinking he'd like some of the same for himself. Or maybe he feels bad because his younger brother's going to be a dad before he is. Well, either way, he seems to have got it in his head that we should be trying for a baby." Honey ran her finger around the rim of her glass, distracted. "And how do you feel about that idea?" asked Alice. "I honestly don't know. Motherhood never appealed to me, as you know, and quite frankly, your clumsy walrus comment isn't doing anything to change my opinion." They both smiled. "Well, maybe I'll wait and see how bad your labour is, and then I'll make a decision." Alice's labour, for a first-time mum, was fairly straightforward and problem-free. She had wanted to have a home birth, but had been persuaded otherwise after hearing some unpleasant stories from the antenatal nurse at the hospital when they went for their final scan. Both Alice and Matt were determined, however, that their baby would spend as little time in the hospital as possible, and were insistent that his first night be spent at home. Fortunately, young Jacob arrived just before 10 a.m, and as there were no complications for either mother or baby, the doctor was happy to discharge them the same day, and with a beautiful sunset lighting the country sky, they arrived home late in the evening. Jacob had arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected, and because Matt had been busy at work, he had not quite finished decorating the baby's bedroom. So for the first few weeks of his life, the new arrival slept in a cot in the living room, with Alice camped on the sofa nearby. The arrangement suited them all perfectly. It was the warmest room in the house, it was away from the front door and the drive outside, so Matt didn't have to worry about disturbing them when he came home at strange hours after a work shift. By the end of October, they had found their feet as parents and settled into a nice new routine. Alice had never been happier. She was on maternity leave, but was still doing a few hours of work from home, so she still felt useful and productive. Matt had taken to fatherhood like a professional and doted on Jacob incessantly. When he wasn't cuddling his son, he was cooking for Alice or making sure she was comfortable and generally treating her like a queen. Her life felt close to perfection. On the last day of the month, just before the dark set in for the night, Alice finished feeding Jacob and realised she was incredibly tired. Her hips were aching, she was weary, and her eyelids felt like sandbags. It was time to be good to herself and let herself have 40 winks. She kissed Jacob gently on the forehead and laid him down on his back to sleep. Stepping quietly back to the sofa, she puffed up the cushions beside her and lifted up her feet to give them a well-earned and well-needed rest. And that was when she spotted the face. It was back, right outside the window where it had first appeared 10 months prior. Alice blinked her eyes, hoping she could make them refocus, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But it wasn't. The face was there, clearly, and this time its eyes were firmly set on little Jacob, sleeping away in his cot. As Alice felt her heart rate quicken, the face turned towards her, licked its lips slowly, and winked. Alice became aware of a terrible screaming filling the room and thought for a second it was her son. But as her legs gave way beneath her, she realised to her horror that she was making the noise herself. The end. Happy Christmas.